so that it is available for other people who couldn't make it. As I've mentioned, or as you all have seen, the title of today's panel is Anti-Blackness and Democracy in Brazil and the United States. I'm very excited for this panel. I'm going to go ahead and introduce everyone, but I wanted to mention that one of our panelists, 𝗔𝘁𝘁𝗶-𝗕𝗹, had a medical emergency, so he won't be here today, but I will read a little bit about him just so you all know about his work, and he's just done some really excellent work. So even though he can't be with us today, whenever you have the opportunity, you really should try to check out some of his work. So I will just briefly read about 𝗔𝘁𝘁𝗶-𝗕𝗹, and then after that, I will introduce the other three panels. And Dr. Seku Franklin has to leave a little bit early today, so I'm just letting you all know that because he will have to leave to go teach. So first, Dr. 𝗔𝘁𝘁𝗶-𝗕𝗹 is a professor at the Presbyterian Mackenzie University in São Paulo. He has a PhD in constitutional law. He also has a doctorate in comparative constitutional law at Harvard University. He has done research in the United States, and he is really known for the just number of books that he has written. And one of the most well-known book is his book on recreational racism. So it's really an excellent book. So I encourage all of you to check it out. So this is the order of our presenters today. Dr. Seku Franklin is an associate professor of political science and international relations at Middle Tennessee State University. He's also the president of the National Conference of Black Political Scientists, but today he's just speaking in his capacity as a professor. He is author of The Rebellion, Black Youth, Social Movement Activism, and the Post-Civil Rights Generation. He is also author of Losing Power, African Americans and Racial Polarization in Tennessee Politics. He received training in voting rights at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice's Census and Redistricting. He also served on the Tennessee Advisory Committee for the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights from 2016 to 2020, and he serves on the Coordinating Committee of Democracy Nashville, Democratic Communities. He received his PhD from Howard University, his MA from San Francisco State University, and his BS from Santa Clara University. Our next speaker is Sara Branco, who is a Brazilian human rights lawyer who advocates for the promotion of racial and gender equality. She works as a consultant at the Center of Studies of Labor Relations and Inequalities. She is also a Black Brazilian organizer and member of the Brazilian Black Coalition for Rights. And this is a group of over 180 Black movement groups and organizations in Brazil. Sara was the only Brazilian to speak at the first Women of the Diaspora Summit, Race and Gender Discrimination, in the context of the United Nations 75th General Assembly anniversary, and the Declaration for Beijing and the Platform for Action on the 25th anniversary. Amika Tendaji is a mother, native Southside Chicagoan, daughter of West Sider, longtime youth and community organizer. She is also the co-founder of UMedics, a collective focused on health justice and self-determination for Black people. UMedics teaches gunshot wound and asthma bystander first response all over Chicago. And Amika, I had heard about this organization, so it was just great to put a name with a face. Amika is the executive director of Black Lives Matter Chicago, working to support families and get justice for those who've lost a loved one to terrorism by the police. Amika recently worked for Southside Together Organizing for Power as the mental health movement organizer, working to get public, fully funded mental health clinics open to all. Amika is also a mother of dragons, poet, nature lover, photographer, logical puzzle aficionado, artful dodger, survival enthusiast, storyteller, base builder, amateur comedian, and a flamethrower extraordinaire. I am so pleased to have all of you here, all of our speakers, as well as the guests who have joined us today. So what we're going to do is our speakers will speak for 10 to 15 minutes. We're more flexible today since we don't have our fourth speaker. And then after that, we will open it up for questions. So we will start with Dr. Seku Franklin.
Thank you. I did put together a short slideshow. That's okay, Dr. Mitchell?
Yes.
Okay, so I want to thank Dr. 𝗫𝗺 𝗫𝗫𝗰𝗆 for inviting me to speak and say it's an honor to sit on this esteemed panel with such outstanding guests. And I want to situate my comments, or at least talk about how anti-Blackness manifests itself in the U.S. jurisprudence and legislative arena, that is in the courts and the legislative arena. And I'm going to kind of talk about from the 1960s on, primarily drawing on my work with a number of organizations. And I'm going to give you just one aspect or one look at anti-Blackness, but there's a variety of other different perspectives too. And again, the work draws upon, my comments also draw upon my work with grassroots organizations and civil rights groups as well. So just to kind of look at different perspectives of anti-Blackness, a lot of the ways in which the media talks about anti-Blackness or racism is really in the overt sense, or what, to use a legal term, disparate treatment. I like to use the term bull-Connor racism. That is overt racism, that's visceral, that one can see it, one can demonstrate intent, one can demonstrate purpose, and it's visual and really almost unequivocal. It's kind of a Jim Crow racism. And we see kind of current and recent examples of that. We see, Birmingham in the 1960s, we see Emmett Till being murdered. And we see even a more visceral example of racism with the George Floyd's murder last year. We see other examples too. We see the insurrection that occurred, or the Sedition Act that occurred last month, including the bringing a Confederate flag into Capitol Hill. Kind of more visceral, overt examples of racism and discrimination or racial animus. And we even see it operating in personal interactions in the private sphere. That is a woman in Central Park accusing a Black man of harassment, and using that as a way to mobilize police against this person. So these are kind of examples of racism and the way that the media often talks about or highlights or spends most of their time on. What I would like to suggest, however, is that the way that anti-Blackness operates legally and in the judicial arena is in many respects different than how it's talked about in the media. The way it operates in the media, in the judicial arena and the legislature, it's much more sinister, it's less overt, it emphasizes race-neutral policies, it looks at other pretexts to advance kind of an anti-Blackness racism. And I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to make the argument that as a consequence in the 21st century, it's much more challenging for grassroots activists to develop a mobilizing strategy to deal with anti-Blackness racism. And so if we look at the kind of the shifting terrain of anti-Blackness, anti-Blackness is manifested often in today's realm through race-neutral or face-neutral policies, or what's called de facto policies. That is that these are kind of race-neutral policies that impact Blacks and have devastating consequences on African Americans, even when the intent is unknown, or even when the intent or purpose is hard to prove, or even when the intent is seemingly neutral or implicit. Or it can even operate in contexts in which even African Americans may be in charge of school systems, and you have, for example, a suspension rate in which Black boys or Black girls have a higher suspension rate than whites. It can operate even in contexts in which police departments are led by police chiefs, yet there's still massive killings of African Americans in these areas. So oftentimes the way anti-Blackness operates today is through the execution of race-neutral policies or face-neutral policies, in which it's difficult to show intent, or it's difficult to show that there's a purposeful kind of book-on racism, but the consequences nevertheless are still devastating. I'm working on an issue right now in the city of Memphis in which every single person, every single juvenile, every single teenager rather, that's been given a life sentence in Memphis is African-American, every last one. And the outcome or consequences of that is it has an adverse impact on African-Americans, as I stated earlier. And how do we know that this exists? How do we know that there are adverse racial outcomes? We can measure this empirically. We can measure this through kind of a persistent, a chronic pattern that's not just incidental or episodic. It's not just that Black kids are suspended at a higher rate, for example, than white kids 1 year, but it's multiple years. It's not just that Black kids are given life sentences in the city of Memphis at one time. It's that there's a persistent pattern over 20 years in which we can show that this impacts African Americans. We can also demonstrate the fact that we can also demonstrate the impact of race-neutral practices by looking at circumstantial evidence and political context. And we know that in these kind of situations that non-racial factors are often used as pretexts for achieving anti-Black racism. So let me just kind of give an idea about the difference between this and what happened in the 1960s. In the 1960s, if you ask Bull Connor, if you ask Jim Clark out of Selma, they were explicitly clear that they were anti-Black, right? Today, you may have a lawmaker who may advance a race-neutral policy in which, something other than race could be used as a pretext for achieving an anti-Black or racially adverse outcome. So we see examples of landfills being placed in the Black community, in poor Black communities, such as Uniontown, Alabama. But if you were to ask the lawmakers that supported it, and if you ask the corporate leaders that supported it, they would say that we're not racist. They would say we're only making decisions based upon land use quality, based upon jobs, based upon something other than race. So there are other pretexts in a race-neutral or face-neutral way that are often used to achieve anti-Black racism. And these policies are manifested in such a way in which opponents to racial justice, that is often racial conservatives, have argued that their decision was not based upon racial animus or racist intent, that they are not Bull Connor, even though the outcome or the effect or consequence of those decisions, such as healthcare outcomes when it comes to COVID-19, even though the outcome can have life-altering, if not devastating consequences. Right? So we see lawmakers, for example, saying that there's no intent or purpose, or they're not Bull Connor in the sense of determining healthcare access, but the outcome of that healthcare access means that African Americans are infected and die at a disproportionate rate than whites. So why did we get to this point? Well, we get to this point in part because in the 1960s, as the civil rights legislation was coming into form, in order to build this bipartisan coalition, the most conservative wing of the civil rights coalition made the argument that they will give a higher value to addressing overt racism, Jim Crow racism, but give a much lesser value to looking at race-neutral policies and their adverse impact on Black folks. So this was kind of a divide that occurred. But in the end game, what came out of that movement, what came out of the civil rights legislation was that the courts, lawmakers would be very vigorous about, at least more vigorous in addressing Jim Crow racism, but would give less vigor in offering a remedy to race-neutral policies that still have the same outcome of producing racially adverse consequences. The Black freedom movement, it was a universal consensus in the Black freedom movement or the civil rights movement, however you want to describe it. Whether you talk to Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, back then, you could talk to Clarence Mitchell, the NAACP lobbyist. You could talk to Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer. You could talk to all of them. The universal consensus was that aggressive oversight to addressing racism had to deal with both the Jim Crow or legal segregation, as well as the face-neutral or race-neutral policy decisions that had the impact or effect on African Americans that were adverse. So African Americans are very clear across the ideological spectrum that the remedies to addressing anti-Blackness should entail remedies that deal with Jim Crow racism and remedies that deal with race-neutral policies that, seemingly race-neutral policies that adversely impact African Americans. Regardless of what we're talking about, to reference Carmichael and Hamilton, they make the argument that even though race-neutral policies, seemingly race-neutral policies, are less overt, the consequences, the destruction that they bring to Black communities is just as devastating as the Jim Crow racism that one can see. And so we can see some examples of, for example, data, white officers that police Black communities versus Black officers, they're more likely to use of force. We can look at data of subprime mortgage rates that are given to African Americans, which lead to higher foreclosure rates, which is what the bottom slide does. And in both cases, but the decision makers will argue that race was not will argue that there was a pretext for making the decision, that they wanted to keep communities safe, that Black folks who wanted loans wanted to own a home. But the outcome or effect of that, right, was a racially adverse effect. So why does all this matter? What are some of the challenges? The challenge is that the federal courts have offered very weak remedies for addressing anti-Black discrimination when that discrimination is perceived or seen as being implicit, de facto, a consequence of race-neutral laws, or disparate impact. The federal courts, those same federal courts, offer more robust or aggressive remedies whenever there is an explicit Bull Connor racism that's much more visceral, in which you can prove intent and purpose. The challenge with that is that most of the acts of discrimination that are being adjudicated or discussed or addressed, whether it be the courts or whether it be, in my state, the state legislature, are issues in which lawmakers and courts are making decisions that adversely impact Blacks, but those decisions are executed under the veneer of race neutralism, right? This is more complicated in a federal court system in which you have 850 judges who have lifetime appointments, in which 300 of them now are Trump appointees who are extremely conservative, right? Who do embrace, many of whom do embrace anti-Blackness, and many of them are going to look adversely upon these kind of disparate impact cases. We also see examples of conservative lawmakers. I look at a lot of the state legislation. Conservative lawmakers are embedding anti-Black norms and race-neutral policies. So if you look at my state of Tennessee, the governor's attempt to withdraw funding from metro schools, from Nashville and Memphis schools, if they don't send their kids to schools, even though there's no COVID-19 protection. That is targeted towards schools that have majority Black kids in them, right? If you look at the preemption of the living wage ordinance in Birmingham with the Black mayor, right, that by the state legislature, those are race-neutral policies, race-neutral decisions, seemingly race-neutral decisions, in which the lawmakers know quite clearly that once they make those decisions, African Americans will be adversely affected, but the lawmakers also know that it's very hard to prove it with a smoking gun, that they can essentially advance these policies under other pretexts than race and still have the same outcome of devastating Black communities. In addition, the civil rights community is also very, very hesitant about bringing legal cases against race-neutral policies if it appears that the courts may side with the conservative wing, the right wing or Jim Crow wing of American jurisprudence, because they don't want to set precedent. And I will say that this is even more complicated today because, based upon a more recent paper, many whites today feel that they themselves are the subject of discrimination. This is kind of a new phenomenon where they themselves feel that they are the N-word, that they themselves feel that they receive both overt and implicit bias from the state. So in summary, what I would argue is that the most devastating impact of Black racism in the 21st century is executed through race-neutral or face-neutral laws and practices. That if we just focus on the most visceral aspects, that is a Karen, for example, who stops a Black man in Central Park, or even those most visceral aspects of Black folks getting killed, what we're doing is we should focus on that, but also note that the most devastating impacts of anti-Blackness behavior is executed through these race-neutral measures, these face-neutral measures that have been given backing by the courts and that is still having devastating consequences on Black folks. Racial conservatives are tactically innovative and ambidextrous, right? That is, they can advance anti-Black norms through overt attacks, right? The Karen in the park, who accuses a black man of something, or race-neutral policies that reinforce racial injustices and that now have the backing of the courts. These attacks can occur in the private sector through personal interactions, or the public sector, police departments, legislature, city councils, and they can be individual and institutional. And racial justice advocates, or those of us who are concerned about challenging anti-blackness, must plan and prepare a total response, a 360-degree response, a countervailing force, by movements in the streets, I would argue, to counter these racially unjust policies, that's a typo, and norms, and to advance diversity. And they have to be targeted just by mobilizing pressure among law enforcement, the courts, lawmakers, the federal government, and the states. So in summary, what I'm trying to argue, at least what I'm trying to suggest, is that the emergence of race-neutral procedures, really immediately after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, to counter the civil rights movement, to counter the Black Power movement, to advance anti-Blackness, has been given legitimacy in the courts and validity in the courts, and it's made it much more challenging and difficult in the 21st century to advance racial justice movements that essentially challenge anti-Blackness norms. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Franklin. That was excellent. Okay, so now we're going to go to Sara Branco. Again, I just want to let everyone know that Dr. Franklin has to teach, so he will leave a little early. So I'm going to hand it over to Sara.
Thank you, 𝗫𝗫. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to first start thanking 𝗫𝗫 for organizing this amazing event. And I'm very glad and honored to be here. I believe that anti-Blackness and democracy is a very important topic, especially in the moment that we are living today. So my statement will go around what happened last year, and then I'll bring a little bit of Black Brazilian history, and just to try to connect with the idea of democracy, what a democratic society should be. So last year, after George Floyd's murder, the racial debate resparked. And in the context of the global pandemic, that provoked the outbreak of the COVID-19. The entire world watched the protests in the US. Quickly, movements all over the world went to the streets to denounce racial discrimination and violence that Black people have been suffering for centuries. In Brazil, it wasn't different. The Black movement here, led mostly by Black Coalition for Rights, also went to the streets. However, in the context of the racial relations in Brazil and thinking about the Bolsonaro's administration, left white people, right, who identify with the leftist idea, they started to call the protests as anti-fascism protests, right? So here what we see when it comes to the racial debate is that there's always an attempt to silence Black people's struggle. So white people always try to find a way to exclude us from the social debate, even though when the debate is only about us, right? Which is in the George Floyd scenario. So what happened here was Black people are like, okay, we gotta go to the streets as well. We need, to take advantage of the moment and start denouncing, not start denouncing, but continue to denounce, right? The violence and the discrimination and oppression that Black people suffer here. But at the same time, there was this movement that they were like, oh, this is fascism. Everything is fascism here, right? So when we start with the idea of anti-fascism, you invisibilize what's happening with Black people, right? So that's something that we hear a lot here, and the reason why that happens, and that's why I wanted to start with that and then go back in the history, it starts with the idea of the myth of racial democracy in Brazil. So since abolition, there's this idea that there's no racism in Brazil. So we are talking about the country who has the highest Black population outside Africa. We are only behind Nigeria. Here, the population is 54% is Black. So there's this idea that, oh, there's no racism in Brazil. All the races get along. the issue in Brazil is there is social issue, not racial issue. And it always started with this eugenics idea of, so the intellectuals here based on Europe and looking to the European society, seeing society that for them were very successful and developed. Here they start to say that Brazil would only become a developed society if it became a white society. So the idea here was that through miscegenation, in 100 years, Brazil would become white. And that's not true, because right now we are still the majority of the population. And the majority of the population is also brown, right? Mixed with white and black. So it started in the 1900s with the eugenics idea. And because of the idea of the racial democracy myth, the racial debate in Brazil was never in the highlights, right? So here, politicians, intellectuals, different segments of the society would treat Brazil as, okay, so Brazil, the social inequality in Brazil is caused based on class, not on race. With that, we spent decades in the society only discussing race, only discussing class, I'm sorry, and never discussing race. That started to change after 1954. So in 1954, Brazil is here. We have the dictatorship coup, I would say. So during it was like it lasted from 1964 into 1980s, the end of the 80s. So and then with that, the social inequality here increased, and also the violence against Black people. So inspired by the civil rights movement in the US, in 1978 surged the Unified Black Movement in Brazil. So it was the first organized Black movement here. And that happened because at the time there was a murder of a young Black man. So a group of Black intellectuals and activists united in São Paulo downtown. And that's when they started as organized movement to denounce all the oppression that Black people suffer here. So that's when we start like, okay, so there is a problem in Brazil. It's not on social, it's not on like class, but it's racial issue, right? So since then, the Black movement has been pushing and pushing and denouncing, but also being silenced by the main media and also politicians and all of that. That's only in the early 2000s that we started to see the implementation of affirmative action. So only in 2000 that Brazil, the government here, the left administration, they finally understood that, okay, there is a huge racial gap in Brazilian society. In order to fix that, to repair that, we need to talk about affirmative actions. And of course, the conservative sectors of the society, the elites and all that, they were against it, because, oh, that's not fair. There's no racism in Brazil. If you want, you go get it. The idea of meritocracy here is very powerful. And because of that, so we are talking about like the early 2000s, that's when we started accessing higher education. And because of a society that is strategically and covertly marginalizes Black people, and then we are talking here about institutional racism. So that means that probably that the officer that is sitting there, for example, he won't say, oh, you can't come in here because you're Black. But because of the ideas and stereotype that was built against Black people, you see that Black person, then you say, no, you can't come in here. And then you're gonna give 1,000 of excuses so that person will be out of that place, right? So based on that idea of like racial institutional practices, 75% of the people who are victims of police brutality are Black in Brazil. And after Bolsonaro took power, only in 2020, 99 Black children and teenagers were victims of police brutality. That has never happened. So we are talking about a government that instigates hate against Black people, instigates not openly, of course, because that's not how the racial debate here happens, right? But all the ideas and the projects, and when we talk about public security policies, for example, they talk about, oh, people are allowed to have guns, you know, so they wanted to pass this law to give people access to more guns. They wanted to give the police, for example, more power, you know, and we know when politics like that happens, like public policy like that, if they get to pass it, we know that it will go against Black people, right? And also, when it comes to the political scenario, when we're talking about the Congress position, only 17.8% of our Congress is occupied by Black politicians. And among that number, only 2% of them are Black and brown women. So besides the fact that we are not only marginalized as in the society, like in the daily basis, also in Congress, we lack representation. So we are literally marginalized in every single way possible. Now, after decades of the movement pushing, we finally got to the point that we are saying, yes, there are racism here. We see like more other segments, intellectuals discussing racism and understanding that, okay, Brazil has a racial problem. But at the same time, for example, what happened the end of last year with 𝗕𝗿𝗇𝗶𝗹, he was murdered in Carrefour, which is a big supermarket, French supermarket here in Brazil. And he was brutally murdered, like he was beat to death there. And then we said, if he was a white man, would that had happened, right? And some groups in the movement for Black Lives, they went on Twitter, you know, and they wrote a message in support of the Brazilian Black movement. And here we were like, oh, that happened because he was Black, and blah, blah, blah. But only after there was this tweet that the big media here started saying, yeah, probably there was racism because people are questioning, the African Americans are talking about it and discussing that it's racism and all of that. So we see that here in Brazil, like this attempt to silence us and disqualify what the Black movement has been saying, and how they only validate when it comes from the US especially, right? Because here in Brazil, we know, we discuss a lot about the Black history in the US. So we know Malcolm X, we know Martin Luther King and all of that. And how here in Brazil, the media use that history and that discussion to say that, oh, but how come the Black people in Brazil do not react? How come you're not in the streets? You know, so there's the idea that we're so like in the margins of the society that there's always the idea that there's no Black movement here in Brazil. And we also know that that's a project of like a national project of like whitening the society, right? So like they keep silencing us, at the same time they find strategies of like exterminating us, right? It can be through police brutality, incarceration, unemployment, and we can, you know, list a bunch of like issues that leads that takes us to the worst positions in the society. And then I would like to conclude my statement saying that last year, during the pandemic, you know, the highest of the pandemic in George Floyd, the Black Coalition for Rights launched a manifest called "With Racism, There Is No Democracy," right? So that being said, we're talking about one of the most unequal societies in the world. And the reason for that is because we refuse to discuss racism here. And the idea is, while we don't bring race to the center of the table, we'll never, I would say never, I'll take the risk of saying never, but it's going to be very hard and difficult for us to achieve an equal society for everyone if we continue to put Black people on the margins of the society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sada. I definitely have more questions for you, so I will ask when it's time for our question and answer. So now we're going to go to Amika Tendaji.
Hi. The Zoom thing is a little bit, I'm not an academic. I'm with Black Lives Matter Chicago. I got to go to Brazil some years ago, and yeah, just lecturing into a Zoom screen is a little weird for me. So the more that y'all can like head nod or shake or interrupt with questions, or I can see faces, the more energy I'll have for this. So I got to go to Brazil a couple of years ago as a part of a Movement for Black Lives delegation. And I think before we get into anti-Blackness, we got to talk about Blackness. First, I think the numbers of Black folks that I saw, is the first like wall of anti-Blackness that hits me, because I live in a very Black neighborhood in Chicago, and if I asked people here, they would think there are no Black people in Brazil or anywhere in Latin America. And that's really important. There are no reflections that filter, for the most part, up to us of, Blackness. And getting there and seeing like a 57% Black population, I was just like, my God. At some point around then also did a liberatory memory workshop with some folks from Colombia, white presenting folks from Colombia, and in their history of Colombian liberation, there were no Black victories. There was nothing in this timeline that we created to show that the Black people existed. And a friend and I brought that up. This friend had been to Colombia and seen all the Black people. I never have, but in Chicago, I've met several groups of Afro-Colombians. So I'm like, if I'm in Chicago and I've seen several groups, there gotta be a lot of Black people down there. And they were saying there are many Black people in Colombia. And I'm just like, wait a minute, like I've seen pictures. How are you living life walking past all these people without seeing them? And so that's, for like working class, poor, particularly people of color here, that's the context, right? There are no Black people in Mexico and anywhere in Latin America or Brazil. And so, being able to visually and unpack that and experience that was mind-blowing. I went during a time where the religious racism, the burning of 𝘕𝗍𝗄s, the killing people in the 𝘕𝗍𝗄s was happening a great deal. And, here, the work that I had to do to get close to like African spirituality here, right? And just to even see that like, I saw some that were so grand that's like, if TD Jakes had a 𝘕𝗍𝗄, this must be what it would look like. Was incredible Blackness, eating feijoada and knowing that tastes just like, to me, like red beans and rice in New Orleans, and feeling like all that Blackness, right? I got to attend National Day of Black Consciousness and saw these murals and paintings of Dandara everywhere. And the memory of quilombos being very alive, right? And not even memory, the feeling of quilombos being around was very around. So I was really trying to sort of pick apart what's the context of Blackness here versus the context of Blackness where I come from, and sort of anti-Blackness. And that, to me, there's a lot to do with, I think one of the major differences is that the difference in Catholic chattel slavery versus Protestant chattel slavery, right? Where the descendants of the Catholics are doing the racial democracy thing. And so I think it had kind of just become a thing maybe when I got there, but everybody was talking about this racial democracy, which is just gaslighting. In the truest sense of that film where they kidnap this woman and they're turning lights off and on and acting like there's ghosts, and then telling her like, what are you talking about? There's nothing happening. You're hysterical. It's just gaslighting. It's like, what do you mean there's no racism when, as Sarah said, right? 75% of police murder victims are Black in Brazil. 75% of murder victims are Black in Brazil. They represent 56% of the country, only 18% of Congress, and also less than 5% of Brazilian Fortune 500 company executives. I think that, there's interesting things to explore between the sort of like fetishization of Black women that happens more in Latin America, I think, and how that shows up differently here. But, the entire West, well, I mean, I guess the world really, but, from the Western context, is very determined to keep Black people on the bottom. Capitalism necessitates it, right? Somebody has to be on the bottom, and it's been Black people, and they're gonna, keep trying for it to be Black people. So we're gonna see, anti-Blackness, everywhere all the time. But what I did feel was this like awakening that felt very spiritual, that, folks were really connecting to Blackness. I met people who were like, I didn't know my whole life I was Black. I just found out last year at a protest, or, and people fighting back against the religious racism that's happening down there, and, racial democracy. So now here, movement spaces are always talking about Marielle Franco, and so I think we're connecting the dots. We're getting it together.
Okay, thank you, Amika. Before we open it to question and answer, can you talk a little bit more about anti-Blackness in Chicago and your work with BLM in Chicago? And then I will open it up to questions. And for participants, feel free to type in your questions in the chat.
Yeah, I mean, in Chicago, we have to really, even break down common, like for young people, what like police torture is, right? Because they've all been tortured by the police. When you start to, if you ask first, have you been tortured by the police? They'll say no. But then when you begin to ask a series of questions explaining what that looks like, then you'll find out they are. It's definitely mainly happening, through policing, but we also have, anti-Blackness is in the air we drink. It's in the water, it's in the air. And so we have Black folks who are really deeply believing that there is an acceptable number of Black people to be killed by the police every year for some semblance of order, as that's perceived, because order means a boot on Black people's necks and backs. We have a mayor in Chicago that's a progressive media darling, right? And has the identity of being a first gay Black female mayor of Chicago, and is doubling down on, policing Black people. We had incredible brutality where I myself was beaten by the police this summer. So were my friends, concussions and all. And so, it's not about identity. It's really, I think, a spiritual thing. We've got to awaken ourselves to like human solidarity, and that we can't afford for anyone to be on the bottom. Some kids that have been probably shot by the police had the cure to cancer in their brain. And so we really have to see ourselves as connected and get it together.
Thank you. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I have about 3 questions, and these are for the panelists. And as I said, for those watching, feel free to type in your questions. So I will read my questions and then you all can just, chime in. So one is that Sada talked about these white leftists in Brazil who, claimed they were anti-fascist protesters, And I noticed that here in the United States, especially during the summer when we had a lot of protests, there were white disruptors who then President, our past president, he called them anti-fascist protesters. And then some actually were. But I wanted you all to talk about, to discuss the similarities and differences between, you know, these white, supposedly progressive protesters, or in some cases, really just disruptors, who will say that they're anti-police, you know, and that they are fascists, and but they are all contradictory to Black rights. So I wanted you all to talk about that in both, you know, for those in Brazil, talk about in Brazil, and then of course, Amika, talk about how this appears in Chicago, for example. Another question that I have is, and I was thinking about this as you were speaking, 𝗓𝗏. So how do we fight against what I'm calling neo-whitening or neo-genocide, right? So there has always been whitening in Brazil and genocide, but what you were talking about are these new ways that the Brazilian government and society in general are now trying to commit, you know, engage in whitening and engage in Black genocide. So how can people from the US and from, you know, other places, how can they fight against that? And your example was that, you know, there has always been just tremendous Black mobilization in Brazil, but then Black activists are silenced. And then only validated, you know, if the white media or somebody based in the US brings up the issue. So how can people fight against that, which it sounds to me is just a new way of, you know, whitening the narrative, and then silencing and disappearing Black people in Brazil. The third question, and I was thinking about this as you were talking, Amika, is that I wanted you to just, well, actually for all of you, to discuss more about how these things coexist, right? So on the one hand, on paper, you have a progressive Black gay woman mayor in Chicago, but then you also have, you know, someone who is not publicly fighting against police brutality in the way that, you know, progressive people would like to see. And similarly, you even talked about Black Chicagoans, of course not all, but, you know, some people even buying into this idea of police brutality being acceptable, you know, or kind of the blaming the victim. So how do these things coexist? Also, what can we do about it to break down some of those things? It also reminded me of Brazil, where over, you know, 50% of Black Brazilians, or Afro-Brazilians, I should say, Black and brown Brazilians, voted for their current president, right? And so, and 𝗓𝗏 talked about this, when he's talking about an anti-crime bill, he's talking about supporting Black genocide. So, and these things coexist not just in Brazil, but also here, where people buy into the idea that we need order, we need police and things like that, but, you know, they are against Black life. So I'm just going to open it up to you all, and you can answer any of these questions. Any takers? 𝗓𝗏, Amika.
I've got, okay, so definitely with the, you know, the disruptive, you know, white folks, Fred Hampton called them ultra leftists. And so, you know, the Weatherman Underground in Chicago particularly was a bunch of rich white kids at University of Chicago with sort of left values, right? But went about that doing very dangerous things, you know, robbing banks, I think, and property destruction that affected Black people, right? And Fred Hampton called them misogynistic, chauvinistic, and 𝘓𝗏𝗺 because they were leading a charge that was going to get Black people killed. And so, you know, there are young privileged white folks who are just like, I'm about to go in racism. It's that important to me, you know, screw you, mom and dad. And, you know, do so in ways, you know, that don't invite in questions or take leadership of Black folks, right? And I mean, yeah, they'll, you know, get folks killed. They have gotten folks killed, you know, and that's something we definitely need to be conscious of. And how I think we fight that a lot is with Blackness. I mean, I think we have to keep in mind that, like, I mean, I hope that Gladys wakes up every day seeing herself as the beautiful Black woman she is, but like there are things that she's been nurtured, you know, have been nurtured or taught into her, you know, to hate herself. And so we have to love ourselves fiercely, interrogate what we don't like, you know, love each other fiercely and interrogate, you know, what we're struggling to and embrace that. I mean, remembering things like, you know, I get heartbroken when I love history and I like to go back to like when during chattel slavery and like learn all these like, you know, incredible like magical things that we were doing to like thrive and get through. And other Black people hate hearing about slavery. Lots of them. And I mean, it makes me very sad because I'm like, these are just the most magical, brilliant people that have ever hit Earth, and you don't want to hear about that. But I think the more that we are able to tell our stories, to bring in Blackness, then it fights that, because there's in the converse of that, we are trying to constantly make it in a white world through white ways with those tools, as opposed to just like, you know, remembering that some of our ancestors went to go dance in the swamp and got it done that way, as opposed to electoral campaigns.
Thank you. Dr. Franklin, before you have to take off, would you like to try to answer any of these? And then Sada, I would love to hear from you.
Well, no, I just say in the work that I've been involved in, I was involved in the first allies with the first wave of BLM folks here in Nashville and pre-BLM, that it's caused some tension to have folks come into the space and to act up in protest movements that might be led by Black folks. And then if the police want to then attack folks, they're going to target the Black folks. So that's caused some tension. You know, SNCC in the 1966, you know, played around with this idea of the White Folks Project, which is basically that trying to organize white folk allies, or white folks rather, to go to Biloxi, Mississippi, and those places, and organize white working class people around kind of anti-racism. So I think, you know, this issue has been there for a long time, you know, and certain groups like SNCC and other folks have tried to address those issues. And, you know, there's a long-standing debate, even going back to, you know, Eastern Europe and Trotsky and all these folks. There's a big long-standing debate about what tactics are necessary in movements and so forth like that. So yeah, that's the way I would say to also Amika's point that one of the things that happened with Trump was that Trump asked Barr, basically Trump and Barr entangled BLM folks with Antifa, and so they used Antifa as a and I'm not anti-Antifa. I want to make sure I'm not criticizing Antifa or saying pro or con for Antifa, but Trump asked Bill Barr to prescribe through his joint terrorism task forces. These joint terrorism task forces, no one really knows what they do, to entangle people who attended the BLM protests in that, to put them in those, to identify them as terrorists, with Antifa being the key to unlock the door to come into the BLM protest, to prescribe those folks, to basically assign them to, identify them as terrorists, basically. And so that's just some of the complicated ways that I think the right wing has done, is that they use Antifa really as a key to go after Black folks. And so unpacking that takes a lot, I think, but yeah.
Thank you. Sara. Okay, thank you so much for joining us. Sara, would you like to answer any of these? And also, there were 2 questions in the chat, so I'm just going to ask those. One is, BLM protests resonated around the world. How can these international connections be built upon to nurture a global movement? And then the other question is, how do Black Americans feel about the responsibility of being the main Black reference in the Americas?
So I will start trying to answer the questions that you've asked at the beginning. And how do we fight against new whitening, right? This new strategies of white. I heard once in a debate, and the guy that was sharing the panel with me, he said that racism is a technology, right? And that stuck with me because that's exactly what it is. So racism is always there, but racists, they keep trying to find new strategies, new ways of oppressing us, right? And in my opinion, I believe that sometimes I think, especially like when we look to Brazil, of course, we need to also create our strategies, right? And here I think that it's exactly what we are doing right now, which is create a narrative dispute, which is, you're going to be on that table, I'm going to sit on that table, and I'm going on that table, and I will talk about my truth, you know, my people. I will share the data and all of that, you know. So we literally need to force our way into everywhere we can, you know, every single space, right? So so that's one thing that I really believe. And I also think that we need to, this has been happening for decades, like the connections between the movements, for example, in Brazil, in the US, Latin America, Europe, right? Our ancestors, they did it, you know. We have like letters from Du Bois, for example, you know, writing about Brazil, you know. So I think that we need to strengthen, like try to continue to strengthen these international connections, right? And then I think that connects with the question about like becoming kind of like a global movement, you know, because I really do believe that we are more powerful when you are like all connected, right, in kind of like one voice. So I believe that spaces like this, for example, in which I'm having the opportunity to share with you what happens here in Brazil, you know, with the expectation that when you're sitting in another table, you're going to be, oh, did you hear that in Brazil this and this happens? I think like what Amika said is very important. How, oh, there's no Black people in Mexico. Oh, there's no Black people in Colombia. Oh, there's Black people in Brazil. Really? Like 50% of the population is Black, you know? So we create, not only create, but we tell our story. You know, I think that's powerful. Like that's engaging in Blackness, right? And here in Brazil, so now we got to the point that, okay, there is no racial democracy, it's a myth. So the Black movement got to the point that now every book that you read is always like the myth of racial democracy, right? So that became a myth. So now I think the next challenge is, because we have miscegenation, even though we can write about it as a myth, the ideas are in the society, right? In the roots of the society. We are talking about like structural racism. So when Amika mentions, oh, you can spend like an entire life here, for example, and not know that you're Black, right? So how do we discuss miscegenation in a way that's why this happened, you know? Yes, you're Black, and how do we bring miscegenation to the table and talk about this whitening process that happened here, you know? Because more and more people will start saying that, yes, I'm Black, I'm Black, I'm Black, and also working our self-esteem, right? Because the more we talk about representation in the good, I will use good, like the good place, not on the bad, because nobody wants to be associated with rape, murder, jail, right? We want to be like stars or being high positions and all of that. So we need more representation of Black people in these kind of positions, because that will make people more comfortable being like, okay, I'm Black, you know, because a lot of the reasons why people don't want to say that they're Black is because of what Blackness represents to them, to the society in a way, right? So I believe that that's powerful. So like the international connection, the global connection within Black movement all over the world. And also we're talking about our self-esteem as people, as a collective. And when it comes to the question about, okay, so a lot of Black people here voted for Bolsonaro, right? The same way that a lot of like Black folks there voted for Trump. And we're like, really? Like, why that happened, you know? And I have this thought about when you live in society that we have like a lot of social inequalities. So in Brazil, you're concerned, like you work hard, you work a lot, the majority of the population are not, or the Black population do not occupy the formal labor market, right? We're in the informal labor market. So we work a lot, we're always hustling and all of that. In the end of the day, I just wanna finish paying for my cell phone and I wanna enjoy it. So it's unacceptable that I'm walking down the street and someone takes my phone from me. You know, I hope that person dies. I hope the police does this and this and this to that person. And I'm not looking at that person's color, right? I just want thief in jails or dead or whatever. So I think that when you come with a president that has the speech of like public security, that's all other people want. People want to be in a safe society, right? So I think that's an excuse, right, to exterminate us, because if we do not have access to minimum wage or like decent social conditions, we will be marginalized and then we will be the ones in jails committing crimes and all of that. It's a vicious cycle, right? So that will make me look at that person and be like, why he doesn't get up and go find a job? I have a job. I struggle, but I have a job. You know what I mean? So I think there is like, they play with the moral ideas, you know, and there's also capitalism playing a huge important role with that. We know that the capitalism, racism, they are connected, right? They are together. So I think the social inequality makes with that people elect a guy like Bolsonaro, right? So that's I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The other question may be, I don't know, Amika, if you want to try to answer that one that someone posed about how do Black Americans feel about, you know, always serving as kind of the reference, right? So, and this is something that, you know, Sada had brought up. In the case of 𝗕𝗿𝗰𝗆𝗵𝗏, it didn't get as much press until people in the US were talking about that. So do you have any thoughts on that, Amika?
Yeah, I think it makes some of our heads a little big, and some of the international solidarity kind of delegations and trips that I've seen, you know, you know, can sometimes be a little bit like American tourism more than like solidarity. I think, you know, I'm pretty well seated in, you only get one name for each, you know, like the civil rights movement, King got that. It was a whole bunch of different groups with different opinions, but you know, it became King. That, you know, the later 60s was the Panthers, right? BLA and the other, the Black Liberation Army and other groups that were working at the time. You just get the one name. So the one name of this time is BLM. You know, it doesn't make that much of a difference. I mean, I think, you know, it's got to be known we're going to be the example. The U.S. is the example, you know, for everything. And, you know, it always just sort of astounds me in that how like little information we get about other countries and culture, and how much more is known about us. That's, you know, that's the intersection, I think, of, you know, the work we need to do for international solidarity, but like that American cocooning and privilege.
Okay, thank you. And then, Sada, could you just talk a little bit about some of the groups that already existed in the US? So I know that me and you, we have already talked about this together. So this is more for our audience. So for example, can you talk about 𝗕𝗫𝗁𝗪𝗔𝘄𝗪, and then 𝗫𝗫𝗁𝗪𝗔𝘁𝗍𝗪, Mothers of May in Sao Paulo? These are both groups that started way before Black Lives Matter in the United States, and they're against police brutality. But I would like for Sada to talk a little bit more about that, just for our audience that's based in the US, so that we can actually get this information.
Thank you, Gladys. So reaja ou será morto, which means react or you're gonna get murdered, pretty much. It's a movement that is from Salvador, Bahia. And the idea is to fight against police brutality, right? So they have been on the scene for many years now. But of course, we don't see them like in the, you know, in the mainstream. I would use mainstream. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. And they were founded in that context of like police brutality, especially in Salvador, right? Which we don't hear a lot about it. We always hear about Rio de Janeiro, right? But Salvador, we call it chacina, which is like, for example, when police goes into the community and kills like they kill like 11 young Black boys, for example, right? So they denounce the violence that happens towards young Black people, mostly in Salvador and in Brazil. And also Mães de Maio, which is Mothers of May, it is a movement created so in May of 2007, if I'm not mistaken, there was a series, like I believe for a week, that the police killed like a lot of young Black boys, and there was kind of like this crime war, like war on crime and all of that, right? And then a lot of murders happened, and after that, these mothers, you know, they became this group of Mothers of May, and now they're like they are in other states of Brazil, but the idea is, so they are suffering, they are mourning their children, you know, but they feel the need like to come together and denounce what happens in Brazil, you know, when it comes to police brutality. A lot of their children were killed, like got shot on the back. They were like, oh, I'm gonna go to the bakery, and they got assassinated on their way to the bakery, things like that. So they are like a very powerful movement, and one of the most important movements, in my opinion, about police brutality today in Brazil. And also, thank you for asking this. In 2016, the federal government opened an investigation about the murder, you know, of like the high numbers of murders of young people in Brazil. And that was a demand from the Mothers of May movement, you know. So they're like, you need to open investigation. We need to talk about this. We need to talk about this. And finally, the Senate opened the investigation. It was like a 1-year investigation. They heard a lot of statements, different segments in the movement, intellectuals, and all that. And then after they finished the investigation, the Senate wrote a report, and they finally got the conclusion that there is a genocide against Black people. So we have a document produced by the government of Brazil, the Senate, writing down that, yeah, we got the conclusion that the majority of the young kids who die, they are between 15 and 29 years old. They are young, they're Black, and they're men. And there is no other way we got the conclusion that we can only talk about like genocide, systematic genocide. even though if it's based on, committed by the police brutality or the inaction of the state of not doing anything and causing the death of those kids, right? So I think that's very important. That was a demand from Mothers of May, right? So I think that's very powerful, and I believe that we need to talk more about the document as well, right? Because it's sitting there. There are a bunch of recommendations, but nobody talks about it. Thank you.
Thank you. So I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I'm just going to ask Amika and 𝗲𝗏 if you all have anything that you want to add before we close out. This was an excellent discussion. I do encourage all the participants, if you have any questions, feel free to contact 𝗲𝗏, Amika, and then Dr. Franklin. He left his email address in the chat. And you can contact me if you need any other information. But so 𝗲𝗏 and then Amika, is there anything that you just really want to make sure that our audience leaves with today?
No, I just would like to say that it's very important that we take the debate seriously. So it's important not only blackness and but it's also talk about whiteness. You know, we need to bring white people to the table to start talking about whiteness. It's very important, you know, because sometimes I see that, oh, but I can't say anything. You know, racism is not, I just listen, I don't say anything. But of course, so we know that white people plays a role in racial relations. So whiteness is a very important topic that needs to be openly discussed in the same way that we are doing here about anti-blackness and blackness. So thank you. And thank you, Glad, for the event. It's amazing and a great opportunity.
Thank you. Amika, any closing, any parting words?
Yeah, I think my experience, I mean, I knew that the anti-blackness is all over the world, but my experience in Brazil made blackness so alive. I felt so at home and so welcome and so, and things felt so familiar, right? And so far in my travels, like, yeah, just the ability to feel how Black is Black in Brazil and in East Africa and in West Africa and throughout Latin America and Colombia is like, oh, that's really powerful. I can feel that in the air. We're going to be able to do something with that, and we're going to be able to win, you know. And yeah, someday I just want white. We don't want to take over and become the new white people. We just want to be able to dance our dances and celebrate our 𝗕𝗓𝗄 and be left the hell alone.
Excellent. I do want to let everyone know, so we have 3 sponsors for this event, the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. I encourage everyone, just Google, you can see the work that we have done. I have felt so fortunate to be in contact with people like 𝗲𝗏 and other people, 𝘕𝗿𝗫𝗄𝗆, Juliana Goes from the Black Coalition for Rights, and then of course Amika, who is in Chicago, not so far away. I felt really fortunate, so I hope that if there's anyone watching who's interested, please just Google and you will find our information. Thank you again to 𝗲𝗏. Thank you for 𝗍𝗦, who helped to organize this. He's behind the scenes. And thank you, Amika, for joining us. And thank you for our audience. So we will see you all. Thank you again for attending.